Broken gravity controls weren't the worst thing I'd had to deal with in my time as a mechanic, but it did take a little extra brain power to make sure I didn't lose a tool by forgetting to strap it down. This sector really shouldn't have its own separate gravity. It was just an office block, but some dingus had decided to repurpose a zero-G sports center to make it. The old place went out of business, got sold to someone fond of cubicles and money, and voila, offices where there was a chance of pencils drifting toward the ceiling. I'd actually been called in to fix this same problem before. Maybe the owners would pay for a proper overhaul soon, and I wouldn't have to come save the workday again. No, it wasn't a difficult fix, but it was tiring on top of the work I'd already put in. There had been a scooter with a stuck seatbelt and a malfunctioning hover height. That's a winning combo right there. A faulty moisture adjuster in the private quarters of an amphibious resident, and several jimmied locks on the doors leading to the central ventilation controls. That last was the most worrying. Bored young troublemakers were always looking to get places they shouldn't, just for the thrill, but they could do real damage there. Security promised me that they would be on top of it. As for me, my time was finally, my own, now that the gravity box appeared to be functional. I righted myself and told the other human in the room to prepare to be heavy again. She shut off the video screen she'd been using while I worked, then set her feet against the floor. I flipped the switch. Gravity eased back into the room, much to my satisfaction. I settled downward with only a slight adjustment to my mech pack full of tools and cybernetics. My hair didn't take any kind of corralling, being the short and bushy variety, unlike the hazard that the office worker kept on her head. She was obviously not used to spending time in zero-G. Pretty, though. I might have asked for her number if I wasn't on the clock and wearing an unflattering uniform. "Thank you," she said, offering a handshake. "You do good work. I'll be sure to give you a glowing review." "My pleasure," I said. I returned the handshake without caressing her knuckles. Maybe I'd stop by on my day off and try my luck then. At closing time, of course. I wasn't about to pester her while she was at work either. After a polite farewell, I exited into a maze of hallways full of quiet chatter and the hum of ventilation. Other office workers gave me space as I followed well-lit corridors toward the elevators. Even moving calmly, a space station mechanic was someone who might be on their way to fix something important. When I'd first started the job years ago, the instant respect took a while to get used to. Nowadays, I appreciated it. I'd had more than one actual emergency that I'd only reached in time because people made way for me. I was technically off duty now, but it wasn't obvious. Until I could take off my big cybernetic backpack and change out of my uniform, the average station goer was going to look at me and see an important being who should be allowed to go first on the elevators. Later, I'd be out in civilian clothes, just another human, a Latina who was stocky and on the short side but unremarkable. But for now, I got to skip the line. I thanked the handful of people who let me. Elevators on this station came in as much of a range of styles as the other architecture, depending on which species had been consulted for it. This one was a Frillian design, cylindrical with glass doors, lined in holographic underwater scenes, and full of office workers sneaking out early. Several humans and 3 big water wheels, the blobby columns of goo that were somehow intelligent. I didn't pretend to understand the biology there. All I knew was that getting squashed up against one wouldn't leave snot on my clothes, but it would sure feel like it was going to, and it would smell like algae. This was an unpleasant elevator ride. 3 levels up, the food court awaited, with much better smells. I slid out of the elevator in a rush. A pair of hardskins waiting outside stepped back with a rattle of their exoskeleton plates. I nodded as I passed. I'd go home and change clothes later. Now, I had friends to meet. As I crossed the open walkway, I ignored the long drop to lower levels and searched among the rainbow of colored food signs on metal walls, artificial plants from multiple planets, and glossy white floors. The tables were pretty full today. A familiar figure was nevertheless easy to spot, sitting alone at the edge. I leaned against the railing to scoot past a cluster of hardskins who hadn't noticed me, then headed toward where a single arm waved in greeting. Just the one, because that was all she had. I waved back at Roca, the purple alien with unilateral symmetry and infinite patience. She had 1 leg, 1 arm, 1 eye, and a clear breathing mask that made the air moist enough for her lungs. It was her people who needed moisture adjusters in their quarters. You might think that this kind of setup would make a person timid and cautious, worried about tripping and knocking their mask askew. You would be wrong. Roka could do a standing backflip on a railing, and she was an excellent shot with a light grenade. The name for her species translated as solos, and she definitely was a singular specimen. I hoped that she'd get to show off her skills today. Our group of friends was fond of a good, stress-relieving light ball game, and we should all have time. I could certainly use it, and knowing Roka's job in the ambassadorial sector, she probably could too. I was right. "Guess what the biggest topic of complaint today was?" she greeted me, leaning her single elbow on the table, palm up. I took a seat. "Unruly delinquents on the roadways?" "Close," she said, pointing a gloved finger at me. "Unruly delinquents on the spaceways. Apparently the route to this station is, and I quote, full of lowlifes and sewage eaters unfit for a civilized galaxy." "Well, aren't those complainers so high and mighty?" I asked as I settled my pack beside the seat. "They're lucky they didn't get stranded by raiders themselves, see how they do in the crud cloud." The nebula of trash and ungoverned ships was an ongoing problem. It had started as a dumping ground for travelers who didn't want to pay recycling fees, then blossomed into a maze of hiding places for a whole range of people. Space pirates, salvagers, even those who'd been kicked off the station and couldn't afford fuel to go anywhere else. Plans and protests and budget proposals for how to fix the problem came and went. The crud cloud stayed. "Are the complainers going to front any money for the cause?" I asked with mock sincerity. I knew the answer. "Oh, of course not," Roka said with a wave of her hand. "Ranking nobility here to visit their minor king? Fixing problems is for lesser beings. And honestly, they've been here for a few days and are only now making a stink about it because they ran out of other things to complain about. It feels like a hobby." "I've seen that before. They figure you'll just make it happen somehow, right?" Roka made a rude noise behind her mask. "I told them I would speak with the most important officer I could get a hold of today, and left it at that." I smiled. "And he'll be joining us soon, right?" Roka nodded. I didn't even lie. Right on cue, the other two of our group appeared from the direction of the taxi lot. The mass of blue-gray tentacles wearing a police hat was Kondaru, our good friend and low-ranking cop, who kept forgetting to remove his hat when he was off duty. It looked silly without his uniform vest to go with it. Before he reached earshot, he had the hat swatted off his head by Vitter, who'd just realized he was still wearing it. We couldn't make out the words that Vitter berated him with, but knowing Vitter, they were colorful and Russian-accented. This was endlessly hilarious to me, since Vitter was what you might call a bug alien, looking more like a praying mantis than like any Russian I'd ever met. But he'd learned the language on a spaceship run by Russian humans, and the accent had stuck, with some variations. It suited him. I'm told the species name Mesmer is short for mesmerizing, a reference to the many colors that some of them sported. Vitter was a simple enough green, though with knee joints painted a sparkly silver for fashion, and he was fascinating in his own way. The accent helped. Khan was a different flavor of eye-catching. His people had named themselves the Strong Arms in pride of having walked out of the sea in eons past, on tentacles alone. He was personally more proud of the ability to get places he shouldn't and to imitate other body types at a glance. Truly, the most dignified of lawkeepers. The guys approached with Khan holding his hat rolled up in one tentacle, rather than taking it back to the cruiser that he'd parked among the taxis. Vitter had opinions about all of that. "If you are getting foodstuffs on your hat of officialness, it will not being Vitter's fault," he said, clicking his mandibles. "And your car is all of the obvious in taxi area. Easy target for passing idiots or any of your butt-nugget colleagues who happen to be in the area. At least you are not parking it next to Vitter's taxi." Khan lifted a tentacle in an easy shrug. "Butt-nuggets are a risk anywhere I park," he said. "At least this way it's close. Hi, everybody. Ordered any food yet?" Roka and I made space at the table. The conversation fell into the familiar pattern of discussing food and workday details. Khan's less upstanding co-workers were a concern, since now of all times the police personnel were needed at their best. And they were rarely that. Honestly, the rest of us had suggested more than once that Khan should quit and find a job that was less rife with corruption. I actually got a tip that there's supposed to be another showdown, Khan told us while he scrolled the table's digital menu with a tentacle. Not a very reliable tip, since the guy was just hoping I'd give him drugs in exchange for the info, but we're looking into it. Never seen armor lights hold a grudge like this before. Did they say when and where this showdown is supposed to happen? I asked, somewhat concerned. The big scuffle with the police 2 days ago had triggered the station-wide lockdown that we were still suffering under, with no one allowed in or out. According to Khan, it had started with a small gang facing off against a big one. Then the police got involved, and everyone started shooting each other. The loss of life had made other fights more likely, not less. If another battle was actually planned instead of spontaneous, how much would it escalate? Roka had other concerns. "Did you give him the drugs?" she asked with a disapproving tilt to her single eyebrow. Khan snorted. "No, I did give him something readily available at any store if he just figures out what section to look under. It'll make his species drunk, but it's not illegal." Vitter tapped a wrist claw on the tabletop. "Terrible role model," he said. "Better than some," Khan was quick to point out. "And no, he didn't have much in the way of specifics. But I have people connecting dots right now, trying to puzzle out the details of this theoretical brouhaha." He pulled a communicator from somewhere among all his tentacles, a pocket that had always seemed questionably sanitary to me, and checked his messages. He froze, then shut off the menu in a cloud of the burbling noises that passed for swear words. He stood on his chair to look around quickly. "What?" I asked, as the rest of us caught on. Khan spoke quickly. "It might be nearby and hereby." He looked around, then stopped and burbled, flailing briefly in a motion that almost slapped all of us. Then he jumped down. "Forget the food," he said. "If the troublesome types coming this way are the kind of trouble I expect, then we'll be hearing sirens to clear the area any second now." He unrolled his hat and put it on. "You're off duty," I reminded him, "and don't have a weapon." "Yup," he said, waving tentacles at us to stand. "People are coming to handle that part." We all stood and looked around. Sirens started whooping. An amplified voice directed civilians to vacate the area, while a different voice shouted from down the walkway for them to cower under the tables like the weaklings they were. It sounded like an armor light, the vaguely dinosaurian, toothy types from a culture that prized physical strength and domination over just about everything else. This usually meant that they got into fistfights and such, petty thievery and assaulting strangers, not the current mess. I stood on tiptoes to see past a crowd of running civilians. All I could make out was a row of police hats facing the other way. It looked like they were defending the food court. But would the armor lights even be attacking if the cops weren't there? Civilians hadn't shot their compatriots. That had been the cops, and also the other gang, the one called the Hive, which was mostly Mesmer. Luckily for all of us, those guys didn't seem to be part of today's unfolding disaster. "This way," Khan said, speeding off toward the cars in a tornado of tentacles. We raced after him with Vitter in the lead, me holding my backpack straps and considering using my jets, and Roka leaping along faster on one leg than I ran with two. People panicked, scattering in all directions. Officers in full uniforms appeared behind us to direct the crowds, their vest lights cycling through red, blue, and yellow. Someone down the walkway fired an electricity weapon. I scowled over my shoulder as I ran, knowing there was a good chance I'd have to fix some of the damage from that later. Inconsiderate. Even if these ruffians had good reason to be mad, they were making it everyone else's problem. I could already smell the scorch marks on the air. "I'll give you all a ride," Khan said, pointing out his cruiser. It was indeed very conspicuous, hovering there in the parking space as the only non-taxi, all primary colors and a good head or two higher than the other vehicles, which glittered to various degrees. Taxis were iridescent as a general rule, to make them easy to spot for multiple vision systems. Police cars did the same thing by looking like they were colored by a child with the most basic set of crayons. Just as Vitter was complaining about leaving his taxi behind, Khan discovered the sabotage to the engine. A screwdriver was jammed through the side of the fuel compartment, left there as an obvious insult, leaking all over the floor. Khan burbled and flailed some more. Vitter darted away. A rumble sounded, and his taxi zoomed over to stop inches from Khan, in all its rainbowy prismatic glory. Yes, all taxis were iridescent, but nobody did flashy like a mesmer. In Vitter's own culture, this glitter bomb marked him as a stylish badass. In mine, it made him a pretty princess, but I wasn't about to tell him. "Getting in," Vitter commanded. He reached out through his window to place a police light on the roof. He pressed a button, and it whooped to noise-making life. "Why do you have that?" Khan asked, scrambling through the passenger window. Roka and I crowded into the back. "Vitter have many things." He put on sunglasses. "Buckle yourselves." "What? Vitter be driving the irresponsible speeds, and you will not be arresting me because you in the car?" I strapped my harness on tight, pack wedged between my shins, and braced for irresponsible speeds, while Khan admitted that Vitter's logic was sound. "Just don't run over anybody unless they're actively shooting at civilians," he said. "Vitter will reserve injuries for pooplings who deserve them." The engine whined, and we shot across the parking lot. Vitter dodged cars, pillars, and people with great skill and small margins. One armor light tried to tail whip the hood, to no luck. Vitter complained as he drove about the criminal element that was such a problem on this space station, and a thorn in the backside of this particular taxi driver. Always, they are ramming peoples on roads, and driving in front of car, nearly hitting, and blocking other cars at intersection so their fleet of 20 vehicles can parade through, making everyone else late for very important things. And now they are shooting the place, probably shooting the cops, but also shooting the walls and potentially peoples. If one gets in front of Vitter's taxi, one had better move fast. None did, thankfully for all involved, and soon enough we were zooming down a tunnel with a metal ceiling above, underwater murals on either side, and utter pandemonium behind us. I twisted in my seat to look, spotting more police cars entering the scene. The civilians seemed to have cleared the area. Angry armor lights and electronic damage were visible even from here. I sat back to exchange looks with Roka. Even with one eye and a breathing mask, her "I can't believe this" expression mirrored the one I was probably wearing. This was not what any of us had signed up for today. As we zipped down an off-ramp and past the office where I'd fixed the gravity earlier, I thought briefly of the video call with someone on a nearby planet. Surely life was easier there.